They believed no one would come. Then Earth's warriors fell from the sky. The station shook so hard that dust fell from the ceiling like gray snow, and I pressed my hand against the wall just to feel something solid. Alarms screamed through every corridor of Ashen Station, red light pulsing across metal walls that were never meant to survive this long. I am Vess, and I was not born to fight. I was born to count cargo and log supply routes. Yet here I was, crouched behind a broken console, listening to the enemy ships tear through our last defense line above us. We had been surrounded for 40 days. The Kelvaru fleet had come without warning, without a single word of explanation, and had wrapped itself around our station like a fist, closing slowly around a small stone. 40 days of rationed food, broken oxygen systems, and silence from anyone who might help us. 40 days of watching good people disappear into the dark, pulled away in raids we could not stop. On the 40th day, our commander, a tired but steady woman named Lyra Kest, gathered the last of us in the control room. Her voice did not shake, even though her hands did. "We are sending one final call," she said, "not because I believe help will come, but because giving up without trying is worse than dying while we try." She looked at the comms officer, a young man named Toby Marsh, whose fingers trembled over the controls. "Send it everywhere," she told him. "Every frequency, every language, even the ones we think are a waste of time." Toby nodded and pressed the final switch. The message went out into the black, a single desperate plea from a dying station, aimed at every corner of known space. Most of those channels belonged to allies too far away to matter, or governments too cautious to risk their ships for a small mining outpost like ours. One of those channels, buried near the bottom of the list, belonged to a species most of the galaxy barely noticed. Humans. A young civilization, still new to the stars, still treated like children by older powers. We had one small trade agreement with them, signed years ago, more out of politeness than importance. No one expected them to answer. I certainly did not. I remember thinking, as the transmission light blinked and faded, that we had just wasted our final breath of hope on a species who had barely left their own solar system. I was wrong. 2 hours later, an explosion rocked the outer hull, and I thought it was the end. Metal groaned above us, and sparks rained down from a broken support beam. I grabbed the arm of a young woman named Elena Brooks, one of the station engineers, and pulled her away from a falling panel just before it crushed the spot where she had been standing. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear but still sharp with focus. "Stay close," I said, though I did not know if either of us would survive the hour. Then something strange happened. The Kelvaru ships outside stopped firing at us. For a moment, the alarms quieted, and confusion spread through the room. Toby ran to the sensors, his hands shaking as he tried to make sense of the readings. "Something is entering the system," he said. "Fast, too fast. I have never seen anything move like this." Lyra stepped beside him, staring at the screen. "What is it?" she asked. "I do not know," Toby said, "but there are dozens of them." The screen filled with points of light, streaking into our system at a speed that should not have been possible. Our sensors labeled them as errors at first, glitches in the system, because nothing should move that fast and still hold formation. But they were real. They were ships, and they were human. I watched through the station's cracked observation window as small, fast vessels tore into the Kelvaru formation like sudden lightning. They did not slow down the way disciplined fleets usually did. They came in hard, breaking apart into wild, unpredictable patterns that confused the enemy ships trying to track them. One small craft, barely larger than a transport shuttle, flew directly between a massive Kelvaru cruiser and our station's last working defense platform. It took heavy damage, its hull glowing from the strain, yet it did not retreat. It held its position, drawing fire away from us, buying time we did not know we still had. Elena grabbed my arm. "Look," she said, pointing further into the chaos. "More are coming." More ships appeared, spreading out in a formation that looked almost careless compared to the strict lines the Kelvaru used. Yet within that, chaos was purpose. Every human ship moved with a strange kind of certainty, as if they had trained for exactly this kind of impossible fight. Within minutes, 3 Kelvaru cruisers began to pull back, their formation broken. I had never seen the Kelvaru retreat before, not once in 40 days. Lyra turned to us, her voice steady despite the shock in her eyes. "Prepare the lower decks," she said. "If those ships are coming for us, we need to be ready to move survivors quickly." We ran through the corridors, gathering anyone who could still walk, guiding the injured toward the lower evacuation points. The station shook with distant impacts, but for the first time in weeks, the shaking felt different. It felt like a fight we might actually win. When the boarding doors on the lower deck blew open, my heart nearly stopped. Smoke poured into the corridor, and for a terrible moment I thought the Kelvaru had broken through. Then a figure stepped out of the smoke, wearing heavy armor scorched black at the edges, carrying equipment I did not recognize. He lowered his weapon slightly when he saw us, his eyes scanning the room. "Anyone here who is not hostile, sound off now," he said, his voice calm despite the destruction around him. "We are here to get you out." For a moment, none of us could speak. Then Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady. "We are the survivors of Ashen Station," she said. "Just over 200 of us left." The soldier nodded, motioning for more figures to follow him inside. "My name is Callum Reyes," he said. "We received your message. Command sent everything we had." I stared at him, still trying to understand what was happening. "You came," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We thought no one would." Callum looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable beneath the marks of battle. "Someone asked for help," he said. "That is usually enough for us." There was no time to process his words fully. More explosions echoed through the station, and Callum's team began organizing the evacuation. Injured civilians were carried on stretchers, others limped forward with support from stronger survivors. I helped guide an elderly man named Pharaoh Milne toward the evacuation point, his cane lost somewhere in the chaos of the past weeks. "Almost there," I told him, though I was not certain that was true. Around us, the humans moved with practiced coordination, clearing debris, checking corridors, and guiding us toward waiting shuttles docked at the station's damaged bay. Their ships bore scars from the battle outside, yet they did not hesitate. Every soldier seemed focused entirely on getting as many of us out as possible. As we reached the evacuation bay, I saw more of their ships arriving, smaller shuttles designed for exactly this kind of rescue. Crews worked quickly, loading survivors, while others stood guard, watching the corridors for any sign of enemy movement. I noticed a young woman coordinating the loading process, her uniform marked with a patch I did not recognize. She caught my eye and gave a quick, reassuring nod. "Keep moving," she called out. "We still have people to load." Her name, I would later learn, was Priya Nolan, one of the mission coordinators for the rescue operation. She moved through the chaos with a calm confidence that helped steady the panic among the survivors. As Elena and I guided more people toward the shuttles, I noticed something strange. Despite the danger outside, despite the battle still raging beyond the station's hull, none of the human soldiers seemed to hesitate or waver. They worked as if saving us was simply their duty, nothing more, nothing less. Once the last group of survivors boarded the final shuttle, Callum guided us through a narrow corridor toward the docking bay exit. The station groaned around us, clearly reaching its final moments. "We need to move now," he said, his voice firm but calm. We ran together through smoke and flickering lights, the station trembling with each passing second. When we finally reached the exit, I saw the true scale of the battle outside. Dozens of human ships surrounded the Kelvaru fleet, their formations tightening around the retreating enemy vessels. It was a sight I could not have imagined just hours earlier. Once we boarded the final shuttle, the doors sealed behind us, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. Elena sat beside me, her hands still shaking slightly. "We made it," she whispered. I looked around at the frightened but relieved faces of the survivors crowded into the shuttle, and for the first time in 40 days, I felt something close to safety. The shuttle lifted away from the station, joining the larger fleet as it moved toward a safer position within the system. Through the small window, I watched Ashen Station grow smaller behind us, its damaged hull glowing faintly under the light of the system's star. It had been our home, our prison, and now, finally, our escape. Hours later, once we were settled aboard one of the larger human support ships, Callum found me sitting quietly near a viewing window, staring out at the stars. "How are you holding up?" he asked, taking a seat nearby. "I do not know yet," I admitted. "Everything happened so fast." He nodded, understanding written clearly on his face. "That is normal," he said. "Give yourself time." I turned to him, still curious about something that had been on my mind since the rescue began. "Why did you come?" I asked again. "Truly." "Our alliance with your people was small, barely more than words on paper." Callum thought for a moment before answering. "Where I come from," he said, "we do not measure help by how big or small an alliance is. If someone calls for help and we can answer, we do not sit around calculating whether it is worth the risk. We just go." "That is not how most species think," I said quietly. "Maybe not," he replied. "But it is how we choose to think." I did not have an answer to that. My people build things that work. We trust numbers, calculations, careful decisions weighed against risk and reward. The numbers had said no fleet could reach us in time. Those numbers were correct for every fleet we knew, except one no one had thought to calculate. Over the following days, as the survivors settled into temporary quarters aboard the human support fleet, I began to understand more about the people who had saved us. Their ships were not as advanced as the larger fleets of older civilizations, yet their determination made up for what they lacked in size. They organized quickly, worked with clear purpose, and treated every survivor with patience and care, despite the exhaustion clearly written across their faces. Elena and I often found ourselves speaking with different members of the crew, learning about their home, a still young civilization only beginning to explore the wider galaxy. They spoke of Earth with a kind of quiet pride, describing green fields, wide oceans, and cities built from centuries of struggle and progress. It was strange to hear such gentle descriptions from people who had just fought so fiercely to save us. One evening, Priya Nolan joined us during a quiet meal in the ship's gathering hall. She smiled as she sat down across from Elena and me. "How are you two settling in?" she asked. "Better than expected," Elena replied. "Thank you again for everything." Priya waved a hand modestly. "Just doing our job," she said, "though I will admit, this was not exactly how I imagined my first deep space mission going." I studied her curiously. "You have not done this before?" I asked. "Not like this," she admitted. "Most of our missions before were much smaller. This was the first time we answered a call this far from home, against numbers this large." "Were you afraid?" I asked. She considered the question carefully before answering. "A little," she admitted, "but fear does not stop you from doing what is right. It just makes you more careful while you do it." Her words stayed with me long after that conversation ended. I realized then that this rescue had not been an easy decision for the humans either. They had taken a massive risk, sending their fleet far beyond familiar territory, against an enemy far more experienced in war, all because a distant station had called for help. As the days passed, I learned that the battle above Ashen Station had come at a cost. Several human ships had been lost in the fight, their crews giving everything they had to ensure our survival. When I learned this, I felt a heavy weight settle in my chest, a mixture of gratitude and sorrow I struggled to put into words. I found Callum again, during a quiet moment on the observation deck, staring silently at the stars. "I heard about the ships you lost," I said softly. "I am sorry." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Every mission carries risk," he said. "We know that going in. It does not make the loss easier, but it does not make the choice wrong either." "Do you regret coming?" I asked. He shook his head firmly. "Never," he said. "We knew what we were risking. We chose to come anyway." I sat beside him in silence for a while, watching the stars drift past the window. For the first time since the siege began, I allowed myself to feel something other than fear or exhaustion. I felt hope, fragile but real, growing quietly within me. In the weeks that followed, as our group of survivors settled into a temporary shelter provided by the human fleet, word of the rescue spread throughout the wider galaxy. Other civilizations, ones who had once viewed humanity as small and insignificant, began to take notice. Reports spread of a young species who had answered a desperate call for help against overwhelming odds, risking everything for people they barely knew. I did not fully understand the significance of what had happened until I attended a small gathering held by the surviving crew members and rescued civilians. Lyra Kest stood before the group, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly present beneath her calm exterior. 40 days ago, she said, we believed help would never come. We sent our final message expecting silence in return. Instead, we received an answer none of us could have imagined. She turned toward Callum and the other human crew members standing nearby. You did not have to come, she continued. Yet you did, without hesitation, without demanding anything in return. For that, we owe you a debt we can never fully repay. Callum stepped forward, his expression humble despite the praise. You do not owe us anything, he said. You asked for help, we answered. That is simply who we choose to be. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. I looked around at the survivors gathered together, people who had lost so much during the siege, yet who now stood together in quiet gratitude toward a species none of us had truly understood before this moment. As the gathering ended and people slowly returned to their quarters, I found myself once again standing beside Elena near the observation window, watching the stars stretch endlessly before us. Do you think this changes anything? She asked quietly. For them, for us. I considered her question carefully before answering. I think it already has, I said. She smiled faintly, though exhaustion still lingered clearly in her eyes. Maybe that is enough for now, she said. I nodded in agreement, watching the distant stars twinkle softly against the endless dark. For 40 days we had believed help would never come. We had prepared ourselves for an ending none of us wanted to face. Instead, warriors from a distant, quiet world had answered our call, falling from the sky when we needed them most, asking for nothing beyond the simple truth that we had asked, and they had chosen to answer. In the months that followed, as Ashen Station's survivors slowly rebuilt their lives across various worlds within Concord territory, the story of our rescue spread further than any of us expected. Other stations, other struggling colonies who once believed themselves forgotten, began reaching out toward humanity with quiet hope, wondering if perhaps they too might receive an answer if they dared to ask. I eventually took a position aboard a joint support vessel operating between human and Concord territories, helping coordinate future rescue efforts for other struggling outposts. It felt like the least I could do, given everything that had been given to us. One evening, months after the rescue, I found myself once again seated beside Callum aboard a transport vessel heading toward a distant outpost that had recently sent out a similar desperate call for help. Do you ever think about that day? I asked him. Ashen Station. He nodded slowly, his gaze distant for a moment. Every day, he admitted. It reminded me why we do this. I studied him carefully, curiosity still lingering from that day months ago. Would you do it again? I asked, knowing everything it might cost. He turned to me, his expression calm and certain. Every time, he said simply. I smiled faintly, understanding finally settling fully within me. My people built things that work. We trusted numbers, calculations, careful decisions weighed against risk and reward. Yet here, sitting beside a warrior from a distant, quiet world, I finally understood something numbers alone could never fully explain. Sometimes, hope does not come from careful calculation or measured risk. Sometimes, hope simply comes from someone choosing to answer, without hesitation, without condition, simply because somewhere, someone had dared to ask. And as our ship moved steadily toward another world, waiting quietly in the dark, hoping desperately for an answer none of them expected to receive, I found myself hoping quietly alongside them, knowing now that sometimes, against every expectation, someone truly does come.